Welcome to this session of the webinar on the future of the island of Ireland, which is sponsored by Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, and the Centre for Geopolitics, to which we are really grateful for the continued support over the years, over the months. This evening, we have two particularly illustrious guests joining us from Dublin and from Florence, just to make things more complete. I'm speaking to you from Belfast. And I think the next duty which falls to me is to introduce our moderator, Barry Colfer from the European University Institute in Florence. Barry, over to you.
Thank you, Eugenio. I will reluctantly correct one thing, because John, of course, is speaking to us from Dunboyne, County Meath, which obviously John would have corrected you if I didn't. So good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
No worries, John. This our 11th meeting of this series. Thanks all for being with us. What a time to be interested in the future of the island of Ireland. So as always, the format's as follows. John is going to intervene for up to 10 minutes. This will be followed by a 20-minute discussion with Professor Nicolaides, and then there'll be 30 minutes for questions and answers. So it falls to me now briefly to introduce our speakers and then before handing it over. So John Bruton, as many of you will know, requires limited introduction. He was Taoiseach of Ireland from 1994 to 1997, first elected to the Dáil in 1969. John served continuously as a member until 2004. In the 70s, he was Parliamentary Secretary in the Department of Education and Industry and Commerce. In the 1980s, he served as Minister for Finance twice, Minister for Industry and Energy, and as Minister for Industry, Trade, Commerce and Tourism. He was Leader of Fine Gael from 1990 to 2001. As well as his glittering international career, John, in 2002 to 2003, he was member of the presidency of the Convention on the Future of Europe, which is the bulk of the drafting work of what became the EU's Lisbon Treaty. To mention briefly as well that John, like myself, perhaps most importantly, graduated from University College Dublin, him with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Politics in 1968, before being called to the bar in 1972. John is the author of Faith and Politics, a collection of essays on politics, economics and religion, published by Curragh Press in 2015. His website is johnbruton.com. John's discussion tonight, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce Professor Calypso Nicolaides, who is Professor at the School of Transnational Governance in the EY in Florence and Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford. Calypso is also an important mentor, so I'm thrilled that you're here. Without further ado, John, you have the floor. Thanks for being with us.
Well, I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak and to meet again with Calypso. First of all, I think we should put this in an historical context. Ireland and Britain are intimately involved with one another and have been for thousands of years. And the relationship between the two islands is one that is, of course, reflective of what's happening elsewhere, what's happening in America and what's happening on the continent of Europe. Now, relations, I think, between the independent state of Ireland and the United Kingdom were extremely good, particularly after Ireland had joined the European Union. Because by joining the European Union as a co-equal, but obviously much smaller member than the United Kingdom, we were no longer, in the same sense, in the shadow of our big neighbor. We had this situation where we were both on the same team. A lot of the time we were achieving or working for the same objectives, but we were working in a wider context, which removed some of the complexes that have characterized our relationship. The smaller island feeling, or the smaller state feeling sort of overborne or inferior in some way to the much bigger and more powerful state. Those sorts of feelings were put aside once we were together in the European Union from 1973. And I think that our common membership of the European Union was symbolic of a new relationship. It's important to say that the first ever British Prime Minister to actually come to visit Dublin was Edward Heath, and it was within a few months of Ireland and Britain joining the European Union. Up to that, no British Prime Minister would even bother to go to Dublin, which is really quite surprising. We had our Taoiseach, our President of the Executive Council, had to go to London. It was never the other way. That has all changed as a result of our both being in the European Union. And of course, the European Union, as a result of the single market being created, which was created very much at the initiative of Mrs. Thatcher and Lord Cockfield, that created a border-free union between Britain and Ireland. Border-free not just for people, which was always the case, but border-free for trade in goods and indeed for mutual recognition of services. Now, Brexit has changed the entire context as far as that's concerned. When this border-free situation, as a result of our common membership of the European Union existed, it was possible to negotiate an arrangement like the Good Friday Agreement, which did something which was fundamentally very, very difficult. Created a structure in which two fundamentally contradictory sets of aspirations among a population in Northern Ireland, one of them wanting union with Britain, another wanting union with the rest of the island of Ireland. Those two were reconciled by large applications of constructive ambiguity or fudge, if you like. And that enabled the two aspirations to coexist and never to become critical. But what did Brexit do? Brexit reintroduced the whole issue of territorial sovereignty, because Brexit was an initiative exclusively, I think, an English initiative designed to promote territorial sovereignty and exclusion of everybody or control over borders in a way that, of course, interfered with the constructive ambiguity which had enabled the Good Friday Agreement to come into being. And I think it is as fundamental of that as that. The assumptions on which the Good Friday Agreement were that people, individual people and families and neighbourhoods were more important than territorial sovereignty. Brexit has now turned that on its head and made territorial sovereignty the be-all and the end-all of everything. And of course, that's a fundamental attack at the deepest possible level on the settlement that we have made. And it's important, I think, that we should see these things in these broad historical and conceptual framework, in this broad historical and conceptual framework, rather than simply looking at the latest concession that might or might not be made in a particular area of negotiation. I think this week we're facing a very fundamental moment. The United Kingdom is contemplating using Article 16 of the protocol to essentially abnegate a fundamental part of the withdrawal agreement which Britain made with the European Union, to set it aside. That's what it's contemplating. And the European Union, it would appear, is contemplating using Article 779 of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which would, with 1 year's notice, introduce a no-deal Brexit. It would get rid of all the negotiation that has been done to now. And there are these two nuclear threats which are mutually pointed to one at the other. It brings us back to the possibility of an economic war between the European Union and the United Kingdom. We've had this experience as far as Ireland and Britain is concerned before. And it arose, interestingly enough, because at that time, the Irish government wanted to go back on a treaty in regard to the payment of land annuities. Now we have the British government wanting to go back on a treaty that it made with the European Union. And that is something that's not good. The 1930s were characterized by people deciding unilaterally to set aside treaties in other parts of Europe. And that decade did not end well.
Thanks so much, John, for your intervention. Calypso, if you're happy to put a couple of questions to John, and myself and Eugenia will chip in as well in due course. Thanks, Calypso.
Absolutely. John, thank you for taking the long view and starting with contrasting the shared kind of embrace within the EU, which kind of led the path to the Good Friday Agreement, but then taking us all the way to today, this weekend, the tensions. And I guess, my first question to you is, this Northern Ireland Protocol, the moment we're in right now is that the UK is facing a contradiction, right? It wants to renegotiate the whole way in which constructing ambiguity, to use your own words, was used to deal with this impossible situation of the Irish Sea border versus intra-island border. There was this constructive ambiguity. And this Article 16 is supposed to be used in kind of case of emergence, for temporary moments, in case there's serious economic, social difficulties. But the UK's real underlying interest and goal, we know, is to achieve permanent, not temporary, changes in the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, the question, if we take in this unhappiness of the UK and all the reasons, genuine or not, that have been stated, is, do you see yourself as someone who has been so active in negotiating and playing the role of a mediator as well as a major political actor? Do you see a way to square that circle between the UK's structural unhappiness with the Northern Ireland Protocol and Ireland's view within the EU that this is what we have and we can't renegotiate it, but only amend it marginally? How would you see a way out of this conundrum?
Well, it is important to say that the Northern Ireland Protocol was in place and had been agreed to by the House of Commons and by the British government before they even started to negotiate the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So they knew exactly when they started the substantive negotiation that one of the ground rules was that there would be the provisions of the protocol in operation. Now, what the Article 16 of the protocol allows is that if there are serious economic, societal, or environmental issues that are liable to persist, and there is a diversion of trade, that there may be measures that are targeted in scope, counterbalancing measures, and then counterbalancing measures taken against those measures by the EU side. But I don't think that Article 16 was ever intended to be used for things that were entirely foreseeable at the time that the protocol was negotiated. It was intended to deal with things that were not foreseeable. Now, I think some diversion of trade to north-south rather than east-west was entirely foreseeable at the time the UK government negotiated and its parliament approved the protocol. So I think that it is arguable that there are not valid grounds for using Article 16 in these circumstances, but that may be tested. The question will be, however, what, as I think you say, Calypso, in your question, what is the ultimate intent of the UK government? Is the ultimate intent of the UK government to permanently destroy the protocol and to create a huge gap, if you like, in the border of the European single market in Ireland, by virtue of the fact that we're not going to impose border controls between North and South, and the UK government agrees with that, but because anything can come into the European Union via Northern Ireland across the Irish border, that the single market would be fundamentally undermined by the creation of this huge gap. Now, I think Britain should understand very well why Ireland, the European Union is very concerned to maintain the integrity of its borders, of its single market borders, because controlling its own borders was one of the reasons that the UK advocated for Brexit. So if they understand the need for Britain to control its borders, they should also understand that the EU needs to control the borders of its single market. And that's what the protocol was designed to do.
Isn't it, John, always about domestic politics? And you know that stage very well, that what we don't know is what is in the head of the British PM, whether he wants to whip up this nationalistic jingoism, you know, us against the EU, and maybe we'll run the next election still on this, or whether we should believe that he had this other promise that was get Brexit done, and that in the end he will want to get it done and claim the victory and move on. So these are rather two different assessments of what he wants to do. But given that we don't know what's in his head, which of those two strategies he wants to follow, what would be a prudent take from the Irish Republic, given the fears that we have? And please tell us what you think about the sustainability of the Good Friday Agreement, and whether you believe that there is political manipulation there, or whether they're genuine. But whichever the root cause, there are fears that all this will kind of inflame in Northern Ireland. So if that's the case, is there a, you know, and given that we don't know what is in the head of the PM in Britain that will actually decide the ultimate outcome, depending on what he's looking for electorally, what is a prudent approach here? And I'm sure others in the call will want to hear you on this.
Well, I think most politicians are pursuing several strategies at the same time, and they may not be necessarily fully conscious of the strategy that they are following even themselves, although they might not even be able to articulate it. In fact, a lot of political decisions are made on the basis of instinct. And I think, and also, if something seems to be working, people will continue it. Now, what I think Boris Johnson has discovered is that Brexit works to get votes. And the tougher you are with the European Union, the more popular you are in certain categories of English public opinion. That's at one very simple level. He's been rewarded for being tough politically so far, therefore he'll go on doing that until it suddenly becomes the case that he's not being rewarded for that anymore. I think that's at a very simple level, that's part of it. However, at a deeper level, I think there is probably in some quarters in the United Kingdom, and particularly in England, a wish to basically destroy the European Union, to divide the European Union. Because British English grand strategy over the last 500 years has always been that of maintaining division on the continent of Europe, not allowing any capacity to unite the continent of Europe and to keep the continent disunited. And I think the European Union, the more it succeeds, and the more it develops its own fiscal capacity, the more it develops the acceptability of its own rules, the more it develops its own democracy. And the European Union is a democracy in the sense that it makes laws democratically to an elected parliament and a council of ministers of elected politicians, and interprets them uniformly through a common European Court of Justice and enforces them through a common authority, the European Commission. The European Union has these democratic characteristics. And the more these are strengthened, the more Europe is united, the more Britain feels that its grand strategy of keeping Europe divided is being frustrated. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in the UK government is following this deeply Machiavellian strategy to divide the European Union, but I think it's present in English thinking. And I think the European Union knows that it's present. And when the European Union sees Britain, which wasn't particularly stressing its problems with the European Court of Justice at all when it negotiated the protocol, now making this a central issue. And we all know that the European Court of Justice and its having the final say on what EU rules mean, that is the fundament upon which the European Union rests. That is absolutely the essential of the European Union. So here we have a UK government attempting to use Northern Ireland and its problems to attack a fundamental component, the fundamental component, I think, of the European Union. And that is a case really of an attempt of an irresistible force meeting an immovable object. And we're maybe meeting it next week.
And indeed, although given what you say on the core importance of the ECJ within the core importance of the single market, it's actually noticeable that the EU seems to be envisaging to go a bit the EEA route and allow the UK to allow a kind of tribunal that could then refer to the court for an opinion.
Yeah, but I mean the fact that that Britain zoned in on the European Court of Justice is ominous. The reality is, in any arrangement that the EU side might make, any interest that felt it was disadvantaged by an interpretation, any EU interest or that felt it was disadvantaged by an interpretation that had been made by an arbitration panel would be able to go to the European Court of Justice. So the European Court of Justice will remain, and has to remain, the final arbiter of the meaning of EU law.
Looking for pathways forward, then, we've been mentioning the Good Friday Agreement, of course, and we have Strand 2, and there has been for a long time now, of course, a thought that the Good Friday Agreement should be part of this long-term solution, and it hasn't been exploited enough. So in terms of this overall question I was asking about the risk of flaring up and the UK-Ireland relations, before we move on to the broader context with which you started, can you see a bigger role for the bilateral Irish-British, including Strand 2, and the whole GFA set context in moving forward?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the focus has been exclusively in the application of the Good Friday Agreement on Strand 1, in the internal settlement and the North-South relationship. But there hasn't been any big effort made to give content to the East-West relationship. And there are lots of things as two English-speaking countries beside one another that we could be doing together that would not conflict with the European Union or European Union obligations, or conflict with UK sovereignty, which is so precious to some in England, that we could be doing together if we were creative. And I think but there hasn't been much interest in London on that. When Tony Blair became Prime Minister of Britain in 1997, I was still Taoiseach for a brief time. I put forward a series of suggestions to him, based, interestingly enough, on the Labour Party manifesto, things that he said he was going to do. And I said, well, these are things that maybe we could do together, as two islands together, things that don't cut across our other obligations. We should be creatively trying to find ways where the two islands draw more closely together. And in that way, neither the nationalists nor the unionists will feel as isolated and as on their own as they do in the present circumstances, where you have this clash between the two jurisdictions.
But unfortunately, this vision that you had together at the time didn't quite, well, it worked for a while, but it hasn't been.
Well, yeah, the specifics that I was suggesting never came to anything, because I lost the election, and Bertie Ahern came in. And Bertie Ahern did very good work. He finalized the Good Friday Agreement, after all, which was a big achievement. And, so I'm not taking away from that, but some of the ideas that I had would have given more content to the Good Friday Agreement in its east-west dimension. But well, I don't know, he didn't take them up particularly.
And indeed, with a big, huge shock like Brexit, that it would have provided a cushion, a better context in which something else could have been built. So, of course, it's a counterfactual, but in the end, we can always ask, well, more than 20 years later, you know, can we come back to some of these intuitions? But before we turn on to our questions from our broader audience, I wanted to perhaps push you a bit more on the broader context, where you very quickly mentioned that that of course all of this is happening in the shadow of various other relationships. So you, in particular, of course, the US. The US is key, obviously, as we all know, to the sense that Northern Ireland might have sense of confidence in this whole difficult time. There are people who question even the commitment of other EU member states. I don't. I think that EU member states will continue to be completely committed to Northern Ireland. But given some of the tensions we've had, but even with Biden, it's not been as easy as some would have hoped, including because, of course, he's obsessed for very good reason with internal domestic politics. And we all have heard him support wholeheartedly his Irish friends. Of course, he will say that. The question is, will he follow through? What is your sense of where we're at now, at the end of 2021, at the end of the first, almost the first year of a Biden administration, with the strength of this bilateral relations? Can Ireland continue to count 100% on the US?
Well, I think we should never count on any other country to do all our work for us. We have to look after ourselves as Irish people and as Europeans and as EU. As a people who are more loyal to the European Union than are the population of any other of the 27 countries of the European Union. Ireland is a profoundly European Union-oriented country, and we want to stand by and stand for the European Union, which we regard as the greatest voluntary peace process in human history, coming together voluntarily of 27 countries. In every other case, all the empires and states you can mention in the past, they were all brought together ultimately by force. The European Union was brought together by consent, not force. So we are going to preserve that. And we're not going to be relying on the Americans to do it for us. We're going to do it ourselves. Now, as far as the United States is concerned, I think there's no doubt that Joe Biden and a significant section of congressional opinion has a very strong sentimental attachment to Ireland. But it also has a very strong security link with Britain. And they're going to have to weigh both in the balance. And now that Britain is no longer in the European Union is going to, European continental Europe, is going to have to look increasingly to its own defence. And I think we in Ireland are going to have to look at that too. I think the idea that now that Britain has left and we're a frontier country, I think we're going to have to look at the European Union, and Ireland included, is going to have to look at how we can maintain security in the seas around us and in our borders to the east, the north and the south.
Although if you ask me, then if we loop all the way back to, I mean, what you said is very wise, and certainly As an IR prof, I would definitely quote you in a country can never 100% rely on another country. Every country pursues their interest. But I'm struck by the fact that there is strategic blindness, both in the UK, of course, in the UK, but also in the EU, in squabbling over, sausages when, the world is on fire. And when we have this huge...
We're not squabbling over sausages. The European Union is maintaining the single market. And the single market is based on there being food standards, for example. Food is essential to life. That there are uniform food standards. If you had 27 different sets of standards in the European Union for food, you wouldn't be able to sell food from one country to the other. And in maintaining a uniform and mutually recognizable standards for food, and I particularly like sausages myself, I don't regard them as anything to be dismissed in a light-hearted way as of no significance. And a bad sausage could kill you, as we know, if it contained products and toxins that it shouldn't contain. So the EU is maintaining the single market when it is setting and insisting on the respect for standards of food or electrical goods or airplanes or any of the things that are entitled to be sold in our space in the European Union.
Absolutely. And when I was saying squabbling, I didn't necessarily mean that it was on the EU side. Of course, the UK has its own way of squabbling, but I do believe, and now I'm going to pass the floor to Barry because there are a number of questions on these trade topics, that first of all, the strategic challenges of our world objectively are so great, and that the UK, Ireland, and rest of EU interests and values are so close compared in relative terms vis-a-vis China, Russia, and others, that we should be able to find a rational way through this, and that indeed the UK has to be able to adapt and respect the integrity of the single market. But at the same time, you spoke about mutual recognition. There are also ways for the EU to recognize some of the certificate that the UK places. There are ways, there are all the devils in the detail. But I think that is also your mindset, John, that you do believe in solutions.
Yes, I think Maros Šefčovič has come forward with constructive solutions to many of the problems. And in a recent opinion poll that was done in Northern Ireland for a BBC programme shows that the majority of the population welcome the proposals that have been put forward by the EU recently on medicines and on customs formalities and things like that. If there are practical difficulties, the EU wants to find a solution to them. But we're not prepared to sacrifice the existential issue of the integrity of the single market and the integrity of our judicial system as it applies to our market for anybody. And we will pay a high price to preserve it. The EU will pay a high price.
Indeed.
And is prepared and ready to pay a high price to sustain its position. And the UK government should make no mistake about that.
And on these strong words, I think we've reached halfway, where Barry now takes over with some of the questions that have been asked. So, I mean, thank you, John, for
thank you, Calypso.
This opportunity. I might jump back in if I.
I'm afraid you will.
Thank you so much, John and Calypso. Indeed, Calypso will give you time at the end if you want to come back and respond to anything that's said between now and then. And Professor Biagini, I'll give you an opportunity in a second as well if you want to ask a question or two to John before we go to the Q&A. But before that, I'd like to put one to you, John, if I may. So you're a former TD of very long standing, so I do have to ask a question about Ireland and kind of local politics. That Ireland is unique enough in the European context, as you know, the kind of lack of a traditional left-right divide and the kind of more recently a lack of a really explicit right-wing reactionary anti-European sentiment in Irish politics. So it's always been a bit unusual We're undergoing our own alignment at the moment with obviously everything that's happening electorally speaking. But I just wonder, can you comment, do you think anything based on what you've spoken about Article 16, UK-Irish relations, Ireland's place in the world, is anything further going to change domestically in Irish politics that we haven't seen yet? Do you have any sense of any kind of forthcoming change as a result of what we've just discussed?
Well, I think Ireland, if there is a trade war between the European Union and the United States and the United Kingdom, that will have a very severe effect in Ireland. It will have a severe effect in Britain as well. So that's my number one worry at the moment. It hasn't happened yet, but it could happen quite soon. The other big worry in Ireland is demography, the cost of aging of our population, the amount of money we spend on hospitals and on pensions and on social care, because of the age structure of our society, is going to increase substantially. That's also true, of course, in Britain. But people who think we can sort of spend, I think need to look at the demographic problem that is there. Irish politics is going through an unusual phase at the moment because you have the two traditional centre parties that jousted with one another since 1923, are now in coalition with one another for the first time. And it seems to me to be working remarkably well. There's very little, I mean, there's some of the sort of friction that you get, and you get it even in a one-party government. But nothing. It seems to be a good working arrangement. I think that Taoiseach Micheál Martin is doing a very good job, and he's sort of accepted. I think his good faith is accepted by Fine Gael and by the Green Party. I wouldn't write off at all the prospect of this current government in Ireland being re-elected. I hope it will be, and I think if you look at the recent vote in a no confidence motion in the foreign minister, the government got most of the non-aligned deputies supporting it. And they're people whose ear is to the ground. And their constituents are clearly telling them they want this government to continue. They don't want it brought down. And if that continues into the next general election, I see no reason why the current government could not be re-elected.
Thank you very much, John. I'll leave
End of the party political broadcast.
No, indeed. We'll have a further opportunity to discuss this, I'm sure. Eugenio, we have kind of 4 or 5 questions I want to get to, but before then, perhaps you want to put something to John.
John, thank you. This was a historic intervention, I think. And in fact, I would like to ask a historical question. You said the present British government is using Northern Ireland to attack a fundamental institution of the European Union. Does this not undermine the Downing Street Declaration, which stated, of course, that Britain did not have strategic or selfish interests in Northern Ireland? It seems to me what you just said indicates that there are both strategic and selfish interests. What are the consequences?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that the Downing Street Declaration, which was, in my view, the fundamental building block that led to the peace process, it couldn't have been negotiated if Britain had not said that it wasn't its territorial interest in maintaining the integrity of the United Kingdom was not being done out of any selfish British interest. It was being done because that represented the wish of the people living in Northern Ireland at that time, or at least a majority of them. Now we're seeing the UK government increasingly wanting to wave the Union flag as a way not of reassuring Unionists in Northern Ireland, but as a way of mobilising votes in England, and indeed mobilising votes in England against Scotland and Scottish independence, and in favour of one side in Northern Ireland against the other side in Northern Ireland. It's a sort of a wedge politics that is being engaged in for domestic English purposes, rather than for any good purpose of statecraft.
Right, thanks very much, Eugenio. Now is a good time to move on to our questions and answers, or questions, and John will decide if he wants to answer. Thank you, as always, for our participants for submitting thoughtful questions. John, I've tried to group them together in three headings. There's a couple on East-West relations, a couple on North-South relations, and a couple on international relations. So I'm going to kind of bundle two questions together first, if I may. So the first comes from John Cartledge, and John is a strong supporter of our series, so good to see you again, John. But it gets to the nub of some of the misunderstandings of what Ireland is like that you can sometimes encounter in the UK. I say that with respect, which is indeed, it's a primary motivator for why we run this series. And you said yourself, John, in your intervention, that the EU is regarded as the greatest peace process. It's voluntary, runs by consent. John asks, and I quote at length, "Let me attend to some devil's advocacy. Surely the British government would argue that the choice is Ireland's. It joined the EEC, now EU, when Britain did, because it was in Ireland's interest to keep in step with the UK. It could solve the current problem by joining Britain in throwing off the shackles of EU membership too. If it chooses not to do so, it must lie in the bed it is making for itself." Perhaps you'll respond to that actually before I give the second question.
Well, we have chosen to be in the European Union, and we will continue to be in the European Union. And we have no wish to re-enter the United Kingdom. We had an active union in 1800 between Ireland and Britain. It didn't work out very well. We had a very large loss of life in the mid-1840s. I think people will remember. 1 million people died during the United Kingdom jurisdiction in Ireland. And Irish politicians, the majority of Irish politicians, elected politicians to the House of Commons, agitated for Home Rule and got Home Rule in 1914, but it didn't unfortunately come into effect because the war started on the continent. But I think that consistent opinion of Irish people from the 1840s right up to Irish independence in the 1920s was that we wanted to be the masters of our own affairs. We did not want to be like the Scots in a position where an existential decision for Scotland, whether to be in the European Union or not, was not made by Scots. It was made by the people of England overruling the people of Scotland. We wouldn't want to re-enter into that sort of an arrangement.
Thanks so much, John. I'm going to move on to a question from Gar Fitzgerald, who also follows our series. Other Gar Fitzgerald. Gar, it's good to have you again. Gar asks, if we move to WTO rules between the UK and the EU, might this encourage the Unionists not to recognise a Sinn Féin First Minister if they are the largest party after the next Northern Irish election, given that they may also be the largest party south of the border? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think there's every possibility that the Unionists might not do that. It is, unfortunately, when the Good Friday Agreement was made, this concept of First and Deputy First Minister was conceived. There should have been joint First Ministers. They should have been equal, not just in reality and in law, but in title as well. And it was an unfortunate thing to the way that the nomenclature for the two chief office holders was designed. And this creates a perception in the Unionist community that they're losing something if the First Minister, rather than the Deputy First Minister, has to come from the so-called nationalist tradition rather than from the so-called Unionist tradition. So I think that in symbolic terms, and unfortunately, symbols are very important in Ireland and indeed in many other countries too. And this symbolic significance is a problem for Unionists. Unionists do feel a bit left alone. And if one were to be critical of the protocol, we are going to see certain laws applying to goods sold in Northern Ireland being made without even the slightest direct democratic involvement of people of Northern Ireland in the making of those rules, because by voting for Brexit, the UK, including Northern Ireland, has lost any say it had in EU rules through the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers. And that offends a certain sense of democratic correctness that is very strong, I think, in the Unionist tradition. And the Unionist tradition, you know, in a way, was one of the traditions that founded the United States of America, the idea of no taxation without representation. Unionists come from a Protestant tradition, if you like, that puts a lot of emphasis on representation whenever decisions are being made. So I'm not claiming that the protocol is perfect. It's not. But it was negotiated and it's there. And it's there because if you didn't have the protocol, you'd have to have 200 border posts in Ireland. You'd have to have a huge smuggling industry in Ireland, and you'd have to have a sense of the nationalist community being completely cut off from the rest of Ireland as far as goods sales were concerned. And in his wisdom, Boris Johnson decided he didn't want that, and he accepted the protocol. But now he wants to go back on the protocol, unfortunately. I think he needs to return to his original insight.
You're just making me think of, so there's a very specific question I want to put to you, and just please answer it as briefly as you can, but I'm thinking about this. When you were on the European Council, your peers in the UK, you shared a family group, right? You were both in the EPP at the time.
Yeah, we were. Well, actually, yes, that's right. The British Conservatives became associate members of the EPP. They never became full members of the EPP. They were always sort of semi-detached, but they were.
Well, that kind of answers my question.
I think it was a very advantageous thing for them and for us that we were going to the same meetings. And this is what Britain leaving the EU is in a human way. It's going to mean that there will be far fewer meetings, and there already are far fewer meetings, other than when there's other crisis between British and Irish ministers, where previously they'd be bumping into one another in the corridors in Brussels at meetings where maybe neither of them had anything much at stake, but they could be chatting to one another and talking and understanding one another and getting to know what might be problems 2 or 3 months or 4 months down the road. Those sort of informal opportunities for conflict elimination have been sacrificed by Brexit.
Absolutely. No, I mean, it's those habits of cooperation that you're talking about. We often think about kind of civil servants and diplomats and such, but you got me thinking about
civil servants, of course, even more so, even more importantly than ministers who were meeting all the time in all these committees, and that's all stopped now.
Okay, right. That's me done indulging myself. There's a question, John. We're just going to move quickly for 2 questions in the kind of international relations of Ireland. Des Atkinson asks, the viewpoint of Des Atkinson, who's from the University of Exeter, I should say. Des asks, the viewpoint of arch Brexiteers seems to be that Germany will pursue its own economic interests and would effectively abandon Ireland if a full-blown trade war was in prospect. Is that how you see things? You refer to this, but I'd also like to hear you speak a little bit more about when the rubber hits the road, what's going to happen with respect to Ireland's EU partners.
I think nobody knows what will happen in the future, but I think the existence of the European Union is existentially important for Germany. Germany wants to be surrounded by a circle of friends. Germany never wants to be in a situation where it hasn't got friends on either side. And the European Union has provided us with a way of having friendly relations with all its neighbours, but without having to use raw power, which it did in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. Germany never wants to go back to that again. So preserving the European Union, the integrity of the European Union, which, as I said earlier, is in its fundament, the common set of rules, interpreted in common and enforced in common. That is a fundamental interest for Germany. And I don't think German industry or anybody else in Germany will sacrifice that in the case of Ireland or anywhere else.
I just want to push you on one small thing before I'm going to hand back to Calypso. But Calypso, I'll give you a bit of context as to why I'm handing back to you in a second. But before then, do you have any sense, John, the vacuum that is before us in the EU with the retirement of Angela Merkel? Do you have any sense of where kind of power is going to gravitate? Who's going to be, or shall there be an equivalent of Angela Merkel? And if there isn't, is that a problem?
Well, there is no doubt that a lot of the big decisions in the European Union are made in the European Council. Calypso is more of an expert on this than I am. And there are big personalities in the European Council. And Angela Merkel clearly was one of those. And she was somebody who was very methodical in finding compromises, didn't want to put herself forward ever as sort of the leader of Europe, but in fact led Europe in practice from behind, so to speak. I think the new German Chancellor will be similar. It comes, although he's a social democrat, he comes from a similar viewpoint about Europe, I think, to that of Angela Merkel, who in a way had actually appropriated to her party a lot of previous social democrat policies. So there will be a lot of continuity in Germany. I think it is interesting to observe what's happening in Italy, where I think the centre is getting stronger. Not quite sure what's going to happen in France. It's very hard to say who's going to win the presidential election. But I think that there is, and I think people probably don't realize this in Britain, that there is a very strong sense among the EU member states, particularly the older EU member states, that we have created something that must endure and will endure, and that we're prepared to make significant sacrifices to ensure that it does endure. And I would advise the United Kingdom not to try to attempt to prise open divisions in the European Union, but rather to do business with the European Union on the basis that the European Union does want good relations with Britain. We recognize how valuable Britain is, how strategic Britain is. We want good relations with Britain, but we want them on terms that respect our integrity. We don't expect Britain to make any further concessions. We simply ask Britain to implement the agreements it has already made.
Thanks so much, John. Calypso, I'm going to go back to you now, if I may, and just to give you an opportunity to, if you want to, that you're invited to reflect or respond on anything that's been said. You're welcome not to if you prefer. But there is a question that's come in that has made me think of something to ask you, which is that Eleanor Duff has asked, would there be any mileage in asking the UN to act as an arbitrator? And I mean, that's a very specific question, but given your expertise, could you reflect on any kind of, is there a role for the international community, something we haven't imagined yet, that can somehow help to bring about kind of a desirable conclusion to the problems that John has so clearly elucidated? Is there anything in the international world that we haven't yet thought about could be mobilized to good effect?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and I would love to hear John's thinking on this. It's interesting that European countries believe that they have legitimacy to intervene around the world, perhaps less and less, but are usually not very keen on intervention on their soil by foreign countries, including by other European countries when it comes to actual sensitive conflicts. It's a place where we invented in Europe, you know, sovereignty, and it's not a British invention only. So in the best of all worlds, you know, when I was trying to push John on positive sum solutions, you know, I always believe that we need to try every single possible avenue for finding solutions, value left on the table. And sometimes when you have such at loggerheads where trust is lost, a mediator is important. And the UN has that credibility. So it is an interesting idea in theory, but I'm not holding my breath. I don't think that European countries believe that this is something they need. In fact, I've been advocating recently to something that I called reversing the democratic gaze, where I believe that maybe European countries can also learn from the rest of the world about some of the democratic experiments in innovation out there. But it's a very difficult, it's not really in Europe's DNA, I would say. So creative, but not in Europe's DNA. But I am still hoping, after everything I heard from John now, that I'm not part of the pessimists, actually. I think that there is enough rationality on both sides, that what's happening right now around Article 16 and the Northern Ireland Protocol can be resolved with goodwill and with trying not to politicize on either side these issues. I know it's a bit of a naive way of stating it, but there are ways of doing this, of talking and looking for technical solutions. And I agree with John when you said, John, that the council is the most important. Some people are very unhappy with this. They say, oh no, European Parliament, Commission. But the European Council has a double power, a power of the purse, the authority of the purse, and the capacity to take very fast decisions because they're heads of state. And these two things mean that this is where the power lies. So I believe that in relating with the UK, we also have to give the European Council, you know, the ball, as it were. They're the ones ultimately who should be involved in resolving this tension right now.
Thank you so much, Calypso. I'm going to put one very brief question to John in a sec, but Eugenio, do you want to put anything to John? You don't have to, but I want to afford you the opportunity.
Well, very briefly, I hear what Calypso says. It seems to me we are talking about two different forms of rationality, whether or not the primacy here is in the kingdom of political priorities and electoral priorities in England, whether or not this means that there is no will to seek economic or solutions which are compatible with treaty obligations. That is a real question.
Thanks very much, Eugenio. So we just got pretty academic there for a minute. I'm going to conclude, John, on a kind of a zinger of a political question. And it was kind of captured by Howard Reingold. So Howard's question, verbatim, it just came in, in the event of Irish unification, will not the new country be faced by inevitable and constant unionist terror? Just to give you a sense of the sort of questions people are asking, I want to repackage that just much more simply, because we like to ask our guests your view on Irish unity, if you have one. Is it likely to happen? How will the debate pan out? Do you have any views that you haven't aired regarding it yet?
Well, I think we're a good distance away from Irish unity. I think the important unity in Ireland is the unity of mutual respect between the two traditions that exist on the island. And there are two traditions. There's a tradition that has allegiance to the idea of the UK, and there's a tradition that the bigger one, much bigger one, that has allegiance to the idea of a united Ireland or a separate Irish identity. Those two allegiances are not about to disappear. I don't think that a border poll, which voted for a united Ireland by 51 to 49, similar to the famous referendum on Brexit in its closeness, would give us stability. I do not think that the minority, if the Unionists found themselves in the minority, would settle down to being governed from Dublin. I don't think that public opinion in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, is ready to make the sacrifices of lives as well as money that would be necessary to sustain unity if there was a very determined, recalcitrant minority in the northeast of the island who just didn't accept it. And remember, there are some parts of Northern Ireland which are 80–90% unionist. The idea of the members of the Garda Síochána having to police those areas doesn't fill me with enthusiasm. So I think that's the issue that's not being discussed. I mean, it's one thing to ask somebody, would you like to see a united Ireland? I'd like to see a united Ireland, of course I would. But do I think it's a practical proposition in current circumstances or in foreseeable circumstances? No, I don't. And I think we have to be honest enough with ourselves. I think we should make decisions in regard to how we would vote, for example, in a border poll, and we would have to have a vote in the south as well. Not on the basis of what we would like, but on the basis of what we think is likely to happen if we got our way. And that's an important distinction. Realism is what we need. And the people in Irish history that I applaud are the realists, the people who accepted a treaty in 1921, even though it wasn't all that they might have wished for. The people who accepted a limited form of home rule in 1914, even though they might have liked and looked for more. Those are the people I like to applaud in Ireland. And I think we need realists in Ireland. And I think unionists also need to come to terms with the fact that they may be British in their allegiance, but they're Irish in their geographical location. They are Irish. And they need to get along with the rest of us on the island of Ireland. We need to make much greater efforts of imagination. The imagination to see yourself in the shoes of your traditional antagonists. Nationalists in Dublin need to start trying to think, how would I feel if I was somebody living on the Shankill Road in Belfast? And people living, in Ballymena need to think, what would it be like if they lived instead in Ballybunion? And how would they feel if they were somebody who lived in Kerry rather than Antrim? I mean, that effort of the imagination is something that we're very loath to make. We prefer to use these political questions as ways of parading our identity rather than solving problems. We have had too much identity politics. We need practical politics.
Perfect note on which to end, I think. We do also do our best to finish within an hour as always. And so we've just gone a minute or two over, so apologies, audience, but I think it was worth it to hear John's closing remarks. John, it was a pleasure and an honor to host you. And thank you so much for your honesty and for your clarity. And also, Calypso, it's also an honor and a huge pleasure. And thank you for bringing such insightful questions. And it was a pleasure to hear you speak. Everybody, just a quick note. Next Monday, we're delighted to be hosting Lord Robin Eames in discussion with our own Professor Eugenio Biagini. And then in the run to Christmas, as I've said before, the politicos are spoiled because we'll have Matt Carthy from Sinn Fein, Ivana Bacik from the Labour Party, and Doug Beattie from the UUP. So a pretty good representative sample and very interesting speakers to bring us through to the 6th of December. So Mondays at 6 o'clock. Hope to see some of you there. Thank you again. I'm going to end the meeting now and have a lovely evening. And thanks again all for being with us. So long.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.